All right, well, even as you're getting food and settling in, I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone here. I'm Tom Asher. I'm Director of Research and Engagement at Columbia World Projects. And just to do a little scene setting, I should tell you something about the sponsoring entity for this talk. So CWP is some 6 years old now. It was originally founded by the Office of the President here at Columbia University. And it was done so to mobilize university capacities to arrive at fresh thinking and new solutions to some of the most pressing issues of our time. By design, CWP stands outside of any school or department because its mission, in part, is to overcome the silos of expertise that exist across the university. And the issues that we confront require expertise that, depending on the issue at hand, might be drawn variously from law, business, political science, data science, area studies, or political sociology. And that's certainly the case with the issue we're talking about today. And in fact, the issue that this conversation is sort of one piece of a larger set of discussions, which is, though this might be counterintuitive given the subject of today's talk, really to focus on the erosion of democracy globally and how we might renew democratic institutions and capacities. So one of the most significant challenges to democracies across the globe, of course, is the rise of digital platforms that allow disinformation to move rapidly, that harvest data on individual users at a scale that even states can only dream of collecting, and to do so on digital platforms that have obtained such a dominant market position that states have found the governance of these platforms daunting. Much of our work is focused on identifying a repertoire of policy options for regulating firms so as to check those harms that emerge from a nearly unregulated digital commons. And we've been focused on Europe, where many of the policy ideas and political will originates, while asking what lessons US policymakers might take from these efforts. But how Europe and US attempts to govern the digital commons is only one approach among several. And so today we'll turn our attention to China, and we'll do so with the help of Daniella, or Danny Stockman, who will discuss her new book, Governing Digital China, co-authored with Ting Luo. Professor Stockman is director of the Center for Digital Governance and professor of digital governance at the Hertie School in Berlin. Her work focuses on the intersection of government, platform firms, and citizens in the area of social media governance. And she previously wrote a book, Media Commercialization, An Authoritarian Rule in China, which received the 2015 Goldsmith Book Prize. She has served in the past as associate professor at Leiden University and has served as an advisor to policymakers in the Netherlands, Germany, and the US. And she'll be in conversation with Professor Junyong, assistant professor of political science and a member of the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. I should also note that this event has been jointly co-sponsored by Columbia Global Center Beijing, but also by the Weatherhead East Asia Institute and the Center for Political Economy. This is a demonstration of my earlier thesis that no one school on its own can adequately address the issues we need to confront and even understand today. So let me turn over the conversation to the two of you. And join me in welcoming them, please.
Well, great. Well, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Tom and Anna for organizing it, and for various institutions of Columbia for hosting and sponsoring this. I'm Junyong, and I work in the political science department here, and it's our distinct pleasure and honor to have Professor Stockman to join us today. So what we're going to do is we're going to have Danny to talk for about 30-35 minutes about her new book, and then I'll have some questions and things that I would like to discuss with Danny, because I've read the book. It's a fascinating book, even though I've only read a few chapters of it. It's truly fascinating. A lot of things are going on there, and then we'll open it up. If the audience have any questions, feedback, reactions, feel free to raise, and there's a mic over there, and you can line up and ask your questions. Right? So, after the presentation, we'll do this in a more sort of conversational style. I'll ask some questions. There will also be some questions from the audience. Right? So that's the plan. Right? And so, without further ado, please join me to welcome Professor Stockman.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here today because I've been working with Tom and Ira and Columbia World projects for a while now for building a transatlantic network between Europe and the United States. And in those conversations, China always comes up. And so I'm going to deal with the huge challenge of talking about China as a whole. And as you will find out, China obviously is a hugely diverse place, just as the United States or Europe. But it is important in these discussions we're having about the challenges of digital technology. So that's really what the book is about. It's, as you all know, the discussion about the challenges of digital technology has shifted. In the very beginning of the internet, lots of people were very optimistic about its possibility to democratize nations across the world. And then increasingly, we're dealing with discussions about harmful content, online hate speech, fake news, distrust in political systems, you name it. And so, especially in Europe, a huge number of initiatives, digital initiatives, have been started to deal with these challenges, and even the platforms are calling for policymakers to be regulated. And so in those discussions, one of the critical questions that are always raised is, how do you, on the one hand, make sure that you keep platforms to be economically innovative and growing, while at the same time also maintain political stability? And so what's so interesting about China is that China has been dealing with this question since the very beginning of the internet. So here you see the rise of internet users over time. And it's so interesting because as we're talking about this in the Chinese context, there are kind of two tales about this rise of internet users and digital technology. On the one hand, you have discussions and concerns about increasing control. My students in Berlin, the number one term that is being associated with China is censorship. And so here you see Hu Jintao. The book also covers the period of the Hu Jintao administration and then Xi Jinping's first 10 years in office. And obviously a lot of researchers, a lot of observers have noted that there has been an increasing control over time. On the other hand, China has moved during this time from being a copycat and creating kind of a Chinese version of Twitter and so forth, towards being a really digitally innovative place. And some of the technologies we're dealing with in the book is the social credit system that you may have heard of. There's also a Black Mirror show or episode on the social credit system, but also WeChat is a truly new, innovative platform. And nowadays, I heard even Mark Zuckerberg is learning Chinese. But how do you make sense of these two stories, where on the one hand, the growing of the digital economy actually requires at least partial liberalization, because otherwise you won't have creativity and innovation, while at the same time keeping control. And so that's the story we're trying to talk about in the book. And this is important because increasingly in the discussion about digital governance and platforms in particular, there are kind of three models that are being discussed. On the one end, you have the American sort of laissez-faire, self-regulatory governance model, and then China is always considered to be at the other end of extreme of this very state-led, state-control way of dealing with the platforms. And the new European model is considered to be kind of in between. Lots of policymakers, including the German president, but also President of France, Emmanuel Macron, they even refer specifically to China and to these three models in the discussion. And Columbia University's law professor, Anu Bradford, also has a new book on this called Digital Empires. And so in those policy discussions, but also academic discussions, China is usually referred to explicitly or implicitly as sort of the big brother vision of regulating or governing platforms. And what we're trying to argue in the book is that obviously these news stories that you're very familiar with are obviously not wrong, but they're only telling part of the story, and you cannot explain how China solved the so-called digital dilemma, which means on the one hand dealing with economic growth and digital, especially of the digital economy, but on the other hand, also making sure that you maintain political stability by just looking at the control part, without looking at another mode of governance, which we call citizen influence corporatism. And this term is explicitly we're trying to be a bit provocative here by emphasizing the bottom-up influences, but as you will see in just a moment, actually citizen influence corporatism plays with both the top-down and the bottom-up mechanisms. So I want to talk a little bit about what citizen influence corporatism is, and then open up for some questions. So in order to understand what it is, we first have to think about what digital governance is in general, and this is some of the work that we have been doing in Berlin at the Center for Digital Governance, is to first come up with a framework for thinking about this. So here you see that obviously, as you move from digital transformation or digitalization towards the consequences for democracy, for political societies and societal well-being, there's a governing mechanism in between, which is about the formal and informal processes that guide power relationships in the digital realm. And in this field, what we find is that there are three actors that are important. Those include government, business, and society. And for you, this may be obvious, but if you look at academic work, it actually turns out that there are sort of two separate discussions happening both in political communication, but also in political economy, that each of them leave out one actor. So you tend to have sort of the communication scholars that are looking mostly at the state-society, state-user relationship, by assuming that the companies are just following the orders of the Chinese government and therefore can be completely disregarded. But then on the other hand, you have a large number of people who look into state-company relationships, but in our view, what's missing is that platform firms actually are building or aiming for profit based on user data that is being voluntarily generated. So we can only understand platform firms if we also understand why users are volunteering their data. And if you think about it in this what we call the command and control system, this is sort of the general paradigm that you all know about. If you think about it, it doesn't really make sense. Why would users in a state where the government is fully controlling everything, why would they ever volunteer their data? That's a huge question. But this is the common discussion, not only about China, but also about governance of the digital sphere in most authoritarian states. And I'm not going to talk too much or go too much into it, but basically it's the idea of a hierarchical structure with strong top-down control. The state is giving directives to companies, and then companies are too scared of resisting. They may have different preferences, but they need to follow orders, and then citizens are being manipulated, surveyed, and controlled by the companies. So obviously, there's a lot of work about China that does show evidence for command and control, but then at the same time, we say there's another logic, and we need to understand that other logic, which also includes some bottom-up mechanisms that are really important to understand the dynamics. And so on the one side here, on the upper part, what we find is that the state-company relationship, and the companies that we look at in the book are the tech giants or the BAT. Mostly we're looking at Tencent, Alibaba, and Sina as well. Baidu also features in the book, but only at the side, and we're also looking mostly into social media platforms where Tencent and Sina are dominant players, but also the Sesame Credit system where Alibaba is sort of the core player. And we find that these firms have developed a partnership that is of mutual benefit to both political actors, but also to the company. At the same time, the state also needs to make concessions to the companies, and the companies tend to resist on certain topics. And we also find that the data that is being volunteered by citizens, of course, there are many instances, if you think about cameras, surveillance cameras, for example, where citizens don't have a choice. So there are some issue areas where obviously people don't have a choice, but in the book we're particularly interested in those areas where people do have a choice. We do have a choice whether you talk about politics and where you go to talk about politics on social media platforms. And you also at the moment voluntarily subscribe to the commercial social credit system. And what we find is that there's a co-production between the platform architecture on the one end, but then also user preferences on the other hand. And it is this co-production that leads to produce the kind of data that form the core resource that the companies use in order to leverage their influence in the relationship. So that's the main idea of citizen influence corporatism. And I just, if there's time, I'm going to just very briefly show you a couple of empirical examples just for you to see how that works in practice. And obviously I can't talk about all aspects, so and you're most familiar already with all the top-down mechanisms. So I just give you kind of a sneak preview into the bottom-up mechanism so that you have a better understanding of how this works. So let me ask, I'm a pollster. I like to draw surveys. So let me ask this question to you. So these are some examples of meetings. Here you have Hu Jintao visiting Tencent. And here you also have a government-organized meeting between high-level policymakers and some of the big tech companies. How many people in this room believe that this is actually a meaningful, that in those meetings something meaningful comes out of it from the side of the firm? So in the sense that they can actually achieve certain ends in those meetings. Please raise your hands if you say, yes, there's something going on. Okay, great. I assume that most of you, of those who haven't raised their hand, think it's just cheap talk. And let me tell you, both of you are right. So sometimes in those meetings, sometimes these meetings are not leading to changes in policy design or in policy implementation, because at the central level, the Chinese state can actually, to a certain extent, guide on which, when the central government is closed and not open towards input from the platforms, but then on other issues, it is open. So for example, regarding the cybersecurity law, there were very few actors invited by the central government, and there were very few opportunities to change the law. But on the e-commerce law that was passed in the National People's Congress, actually there is some evidence that the companies were able to change the letter of the law. And this was signaled by just inviting more actors into those meetings. So the companies can sort of read, is this a closed issue or is this an open issue? But then also when you go more down from the central government towards lower levels of government in China, we actually detect that there is a huge variation, both in terms of both in regions across China, but also across the platforms, and also across different digital domains when we look at whether this is closed or open. So in the end, you have a huge mix of these command and control modes or the citizen influence corporatism modes in China. But in those meetings, if the firms can leverage their core resources, which is data, it is those data and their infrastructure that are being built around those data, and it's also the expertise of the companies that is based on the data that that legitimizes their influence in those political conversations. So this is just from our interviews. with tech developers in China from 2015, 2016, so before COVID. But we talked to 20 people who were designing platforms in China, and you can see from those citations that they all emphasize the importance of attracting a large number of users, but also getting the users who are using the platform to be engaged more, which is exactly the same types of business models that US-based platforms are also based on. And in order to increase user engagement, platforms in China, just as anywhere in the world, are trying to address the user need. So this is just to make that point that Chinese companies, in terms of the logic, are actually striking similar to other kinds of platforms. And so this is an example of how platforms then use those user-generated data in order to make money and sell services specifically to government officials. We also have some examples in the book in terms of data science for policymaking, but this is in the area of public opinion guidance in China. And so here, this is an example of how some of the notices look like that China Files, actually, who's in the audience right now, and who we're very grateful to sharing some of this publicly available notices, helped us to understand what the logics are on the side of the government of giving out contracts to these firms, because these are notices. They're not exactly contracts, but they're notices that are published, especially when the government makes the argument there's only one platform, in this particular case it's Sina, that is able to provide a certain service. So this is when the government is making procurements. And this displays that there is a certain degree of dependency on the side of the state towards those platforms. And you can see here, Sina was chosen because it's seen as the #1 platform on hot topics and trends. And here, the propaganda department of Fuzhou in Fujian province aimed to promote the beautiful scenery and life of the city, highlighting the hardworking people and achievements of the CCP. So this is just one example of millions of interactions between platforms and local government officials. And what's important about this is that there is a financial transaction happening, so there's an exchange here, so that it's really of mutual benefit to both sides. So this is also what is called instrumental business power. Culpepper and Thelen have talked about this mostly in the American context, but we find evidence in the book that this is also happening in China. And this is not responsiveness. Jiang Yu has been doing some really important work on responsiveness, where the government is responsive to users. But in this case, this is different because it's really a mutual, it's really of mutual benefit. And it actually leads to influence on the design of the policies and also of implementation. So I think I should be coming to an end. Let me just fast forward very quickly that this kind of partnership actually has very important implications for political trust. And now I'm looping back to how I started initially about the digital dilemma. So why is this important for the digital dilemma? Because on the one hand, government funding provides a very important resource for the firm. Nowadays, that's why they're offering the services. But then on the other hand, it is precisely because the platforms are given a partial freedom to innovate, which I'm happy to talk about this in more detail during the discussion, that users who are experiencing the logic of citizen influence corporatism are actually ending up trusting the Chinese state more. So this is why this is the core of the logic that helps to lead to digital innovation and economic development, and at the same time political stability. I just want to show you these these data from a public opinion survey we conducted in 2018. This is the last of a kind. This kind of work can no longer be done in China. And it's a nationally representative survey that focuses on the internet. So to our knowledge, this is the only survey, nationally representative survey that has been done in China on these topics. And the book draws a lot on this important source of data to show especially how the Chinese general public is reacting and perceiving this governance mode. And what you can see here is that most people in China have some experience of censorship, which is part of the command and control system. And the logic that obviously everybody has experienced, whoever lived in China. But there is also quite some variation. So there are a lot of people who think that the internet, based on their personal experiences, is slightly controlled. Some people think it's somewhat controlled, and then there are about 25% who think it's highly controlled. And this matters because, especially when you think it's less controlled, which is the area of where citizen influence corporatism takes place, you become more trusting of the central government. So people who think it's highly controlled, this is just a positive relationship here between perceiving less control and then greater trust in the central government. So just to sum up here, digital governance in China is characterized by the interrelationship between three actors, and the state-business partnership is characterized by collusion on the one hand, but also on resistance. I didn't really get to talk about resistance very much, but I'm happy to do so during the discussion. There's a lot of variation of how this plays out across issue areas, across platforms, and also regionally. And citizens' experiences with the policy implementation actually matters for whether they trust the system, and especially command and control. If they experience command and control, it actually has a negative implication on political trust, which we have also seen in the blank sheet paper protests. So just to loop back to this question of, is China Big Brother? Partially yes, but also partially no, because otherwise the Chinese government cannot address the digital dilemma. So in order to solve it, you definitely need to take into account citizen influence corporatism. On that note, I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great, thank you. Well, no, thanks, Danny, for a fascinating talk. And if the audience have any questions, feel free to line up and ask them. But while our audience are thinking about questions, so let me start with a few. Actually, let me start with one. First of all, I really like the talk and the book behind it. I think it's such an important and impressive feat. Not only in terms of the topic, digitalization and how to govern data, the political data. I think that these are some of the most important and most pressing questions that not China, but the humanity is facing today, right? So it's really great that and China is such an important and relevant case, right? Given its own sort of independent technological infrastructure and the progress it's made on some of these things. So I think this is a really impressive book, and not to mention that being able to do a survey in China, talking to real people, having face-to-face interviews. I think we haven't had that for a long time, and hopefully we will be able to have more in the future. But I think being able to go to the field and pulling this whole survey off is really, really impressive, right? So so since we're in the business school, I want to start a question about the corporations, right? So and you talk about this interesting model of digital governance in China. You call this citizen-influenced corporatism, right? So I'd like you to sort of flesh out certain aspect of it a little bit more, right? So starting with the corporations, you think about the corporations, and one of the greatest fear or horror stories that people tell in this country, right, about Chinese companies, Chinese firms, is that when push comes to shove, right, when the Chinese government or the big brothers come to those companies and ask them to hand over data or give out information about their customers, right? The prevailing impression is that there's no way for them to say no. There's no way for them to. There's no leeway, basically. Like you can run away or say no or reject. That's why TikTok is a national security threat, right? Because so this is something that a lot of people are concerned both within and outside China, right? But in your book, if we think about this citizen influence corporatism model, it seems that you're telling a slightly different story there. I mean, the firms are not that constrained. They have some autonomy. They have some leverage, if you will, against the government. Right? Is that true? Right? Is that how we should think about it? If push comes to shove, the government comes in, then they ask the firm to do certain things. Like, can those firms can they say no? And if they can, like, what are their leverages and what are their power? I mean.
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of the work that Han Rungbin has been doing points towards the fact that the size of the firms matter. So the smaller firms actually have less opportunities for resistance. But these large firms that we're talking about in the book, we do find some evidence that they prolong the process. So, for example, in case of the commercial social credit system, only a handful of companies were given licenses to develop the commercial social credit system, including Alibaba was one of those firms that developed Sesame Credit. And according to the plan of the national government, the social credit system was going to provide it was supposed to be a national system with one centralized data source. But because these initiatives are done by different firms, the firms don't have an incentive to share data because they're the source of their business model. But at the same time, also, actually, our survey shows that Chinese users, a very large percentage of them actually do have privacy concerns. And when you talk to tech developers, they actually will also say, we have no incentive to share our data or to link, for example, on Tencent's side, we have no incentive to link our data from WeChat on social media, perhaps political views that are being shared with financial data, because we know that our users are really concerned about privacy. And so then what we can show through process tracing in one of our chapters is that the companies have tried to prolong that process as much as they could do. And ultimately they made a solution themselves. They proposed a solution that would help to overcome this problem of fragmented data sources. But we do not know to what extent the solution really fully overcomes this problem. And so to go back to your question, these firms can never openly say in China that they have the power for resistance, because then an antitrust campaign is going to be launched against them, and they know very well that you can't openly talk about company influence. But in practice, we do see the effects. And nevertheless, there's always a risk. But that risk, I wonder to what extent this kind of risk also exists in other kinds of political systems, just to throw that out there for a discussion.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the answer. This is really interesting, right? So, and also at some level, I feel like this is, the delay tactics you mentioned. I mean, this is not something unique to, how corporations deal with the Chinese government. A lot of the, within the government, like how the lower level responded to, unreasonable demands from the higher level. I mean, this seems to be like a general way to deal with or resist against the political authority. You don't openly say no, or you don't openly rebel, right? But then, despite what you say on surface, and there's a lot of, in terms of the practice, right, there's still a lot of leeway that you can do. Especially when you're the ones who control the data, you have the technology, and know what is going on the ground. So this is really interesting. I also want to ask you about the role of citizens, because your model is called citizen-influenced corporatism, so presumably citizens play a role. Right? So how should we think about the role of the citizens? Right? If you think about the typical image of a digital citizen, or in China, in this digital age, we have sort of different images of it, right? We know from some surveys that Chinese citizens, when they compare to their American or European counterparts, they tend to be relatively sort of tolerant of surveillance or invasion of privacy, or they're supportive of a lot of the things, arrangements or technologies that might have negative implications for your privacy, right? So that's something that we know. But on the other hand, we also know that Chinese citizens are very contentious, right? So, if they feel like their interests being offended, and they're being wronged in certain ways, and a lot of them will get together and protest and make demands, and sometimes pretty in a very sort of ferocious and feisty way. Right? So how should we think about the role of citizens in this whole sort of digital governance arrangement? Like when we talk about they're having influence, like what kind of influence we talk about, and how do they exert influence?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, of course, because citizen influence here is not that obvious. So I want to start sort of looping back to my earlier work, which was about commercialization of traditional media in China, which was done in the 1980s and the 1990s, when newspapers moved from being completely funded by the Chinese state towards using advertising as a main funding source. And so this created a different incentive structure inside media in China, where in sort of the pre-advertising age, they were mostly looking towards satisfying officials. So sort of most for the party papers, these were the propaganda department, because the newspapers, for example, had to register with those institutions, and so their boss was the state, essentially, and they also got funding from the state. And then with advertising becoming a major source of income, the journalists' perception of who they should target to really changed, and it tied them to the audiences, their readers and their viewers, and basically a general media audience. And so in the book, we're making the argument that something similar is a shift is happening now in China. Of course, there's a debate also as to whether platforms are companies that offer services or whether they are actually media. And in China, they're actually considered to be media by law. But there's a new shift that is happening where if your source of income now is data, you are indirectly also tied towards not every citizen, but those who are the data producers. And we do show in the book that there is some inequalities in terms of who contributes the data and therefore is more influential in the partnership, because the kinds of solutions that are being proposed by the companies to the state officials are based on those user data, but they don't cover every single citizen. They cover those kinds of people who are willing to volunteer more data. So that this influence is going or taking place indirectly. But then going back to, there's a second part to the citizen influence, which is that it's not at the individual level, as you all know by being those data producers yourself. As an individual, you can exercise very little power or influence over the behavior of the firm. But in the aggregate, actually it matters a lot. And so when it happens that users start to migrate to other kinds of platforms, as it happened, for example, when Elon Musk took over Twitter, lots of people migrated from Twitter to other platforms. So in certain events, when this happens, that's when users can really exercise some of their power. And Chinese users, what makes them different from users in other countries is that they're early adopters. Chinese users really like to try out new products, and they will shift, they're more easily to move into new products if they get the sense that that's the thing to do. So in that way, maybe to a certain extent, Chinese companies, because of the nature of their users, are a little bit more tied to the aggregate user behavior. But we need to examine this further.
So market power is one of the leverages that Chinese users have, right? So that's interesting. I'm so glad that you mentioned about your prior work. This is one of the things I was thinking. One of the things that was on my mind while reading some of the chapters you sent me was actually when I was reading it, I had an impression. I was like this seems very related to Danny's prior work, media commercialization, right? So especially when you mentioned that in the realm of digital governance, there had been this transition from like a command control system to a more sort of cooperative arrangement. And I was looking at this and I thought, isn't that the same transition had already happened in like media realm? Right? If you think about in the 80s, most of the media's state controlled and their official piece. But one big change that happened in the reform era is that you have these commercialized media. So thinking about these two transitions, I feel like there's almost some sort of parallels between them, right? If you think about the nature of the arrangement, right? And so essentially, I feel like what happened is that once you sort of open it up and liberalized, and then there's information and there's technology that is now being controlled by the state, right? So now you have these non-political sort of corporate actors in charge of the valuable resources, whether it's information, whether it's reputation, whether it's technology, right? But then in order to govern, the state has to sort of work with them in a way, and get their trust and give them what they want, and forming a collaborative relationship, or some people would call public-private partnership or co-production, right, in order to govern. Do you see a parallel there? Like, is this something that you're envisioning, like when you're writing the book? I just want to try to understand, what you're thinking, because I see this parallel quite a bit.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you saw the parallel, because actually this book was initially triggered by questions when I presented my first book, because that book was about traditional media, and everybody was asking me, "That's all great that you talk about newspapers, but nobody reads newspapers anymore. So how does this work in the digital realm?" And it took me and then also Ting 10 years to figure out the story. But there's definitely a parallel to just the influence of commercial logics into organizations that produce knowledge. I would say what's really different, and that's the reason why it took me as a good German who constantly think very seriously about questions, why it took so long was that technology, when you enter technology into the discussion, it gets really complex, because especially digital technology is based on very small increments of time, and there is this strong interaction constantly between the platform and the users. And even though when I presented the book just right now, I emphasized how the business logic is built into the technological design of the platform. In fact, there are many moving variables simultaneously, such as user preferences, but then also the political logic that is being built inside the algorithms and the automated systems inside the platform that are also playing a role. And so the composition of these parts is not easy to figure out empirically.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, and also if you think about what might be one of the parallels between media and these tech companies, is that they have a huge client base, and the client base is basically primarily interact with not with the state, but with these commercial entities, right? And so in a way they are sort of in a dilemma, right? I mean, on the one hand they have to do things that please their clients, but then at the same time, they have to deal with the state authority, right? And for the state, from the state's perspective, I mean, these corporations or these media outlets, they're not 100% under the state's control, but sometimes it's a problem, right? But sometimes this is also an advantage, right? Because it allows you to reach out to more audiences, and sometimes you can hide behind them without exposing yourself, right? But at the same time, for these corporations, the client is also your leverage against the state, right? So in a way, they're too important or too big to fail, and if the state comes at them, you have the clients with them, right? I mean, they're the corporations are a very significant part of the client's life, and their source of entertainment, source of information, right? So I feel like these are, but you're absolutely right that if you think about the digital world, it's the interaction is much more compressed and much more frequent, right? So unlike newspaper, which you see like every day, but this is like every second and a millisecond, right? Is there any questions from the audience before we? Yeah. Yes, please. Do you mind speaking into the mic?
Hi, thank you so much for coming from Germany, I guess. My name is Andrea Vega. I study at the School of International and Public Affairs, specifically looking at news integrity and technology policy. So this may not be as related to your book, but I had a question just generally on social media regulation. I think in the United States and in Europe, we've seen a lot of conversations on online intermediary liability law. And people are thinking of, what's the responsibility of the platform? Should there be harmful content? Should there be disinformation? And given the complicated relationship that you're talking about, the partnerships with states and companies in China, what's the responsibility? Do the platforms have any responsibility for the kind of information that is on the platform? I guess if you could just speak about how that state model is very different to the right, as Anu Braff would say, like the rights and the innovation market here. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I'm so excited about your question because it gets me to talk about both hats that I'm wearing, my China hat and my European hat, because this term responsibility is a term that has been a part of this discussion in China for a long time, but it's increasingly also used, especially when the European Commission has passed the Digital Markets and the Digital Services Act. And this is an attempt by the European Commission to define very clearly what the obligations are on the side of the platforms, and most of them are American-based platforms, in order to make sure that they reduce the risks that they pose for society. And in that discussion, social responsibility or responsibility is also used as a term. When in China, when this term is being used, it has a much stronger political connotation. So that means responsible behavior on the side of the platforms is definitely when the platforms would have strong content moderation. So here in the Chinese context, of course, oftentimes people talk about censorship, but content moderation is just another term for the same thing. It refers to the deletion, blocking, and filtering of content on social media platforms. And so then responsibility means that you make sure that content does not cause instability, so incidents of protests, for example, both virally, but also so online, but also in the real world. And so social responsibility in China definitely also means to know where your boundaries are. So there's a lot of gray area, of course. So it's very difficult often for in China on some topics like Xinjiang, for example, or Tibet. It's very clear that these are sensitive topics, but there's lots of topics that are sort of in the gray area where it's not always so clear, and you can really step into landmines oftentimes as well. So some people are risk averse, some people are more risk takers, but you're definitely more responsible if you are cautious. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And then just to quickly follow up on that, because you started the talk by sort of mentioning the three distinct models of digital governance. And this is also how we conventionally think about it, right? So one thing I'm interested in is when you're in China, so, talking to the officials or people in the tech companies, do you discussion of other models, the American model, the European model, come up in your conversation with your Chinese informants? Are they aware of these alternative models, and do they have a view on those things?
That's a great question. I haven't been to China since COVID, and most of these, at least the European initiatives, have passed since COVID. So I'm looking forward to figuring out the answer to the question about Europe in the future. But when we talk to tech developers, we talk to them a lot about the design and technical questions. I'm not sure how open they would be to talk more about the broader implications, but I'm sure that especially firms that are active internationally, so definitely TikTok, you can, just a few weeks ago, there were some workshops held by the European Commission where TikTok presented how they are going to implement the Digital Markets Act. And inside those platforms, certainly there are groups of workers that are dealing with the implementation of these models. But in this case, this was done completely with the group of people working outside of China.
Well, that's interesting. Any other questions from the audience?
I have a brief question, and then I'm going to pass it over to an additional audience member. Thank you for this. Danny, on your last point, the thing that's sticking with me is something you said earlier, which is that Chinese tech firms are tied to the nature of their users, and their relative importance to the Chinese state is obviously going to depend on who those users are. I'm thinking through, we've mentioned TikTok a few times, there's also Temu, which is maybe in a different category, but as that user base extends beyond China, how does the equation change for the Chinese state? Are they more apt to regulate or collaborate or corroborate with the firms that have this kind of larger pool?
Yeah. I wish I had an answer to your question, and that's what my next project is about. It's about Chinese tech companies in Europe. There is, in research about Chinese tech companies outside of China, there's always the assumption that this is command and control, so very clearly the Chinese state is leveraging their influence through the Belts and Roads initiatives and tech companies abroad. So there's not a lot of critical assessment or investigations into talking to some of these companies and figuring out to what extent they are actually becoming more responsive to the users abroad. But there is evidence that the antitrust campaign in particular has led some of the big tech companies in China to still keep their headquarters in China, but they have moved certain teams away from China into actually Germany, amongst all places. and I think that has something to do with their business strategy, where lots of their revenue is actually generated abroad, and at the same time the realization that they have to figure out the right balance between, on the one hand, of course, staying in China and as a Chinese tech company, they always have strong ties to the Chinese market, but then also moving certain parts of the company outside sort of signals how important those parts are for their business, and presumably that also has some effect on their own development.
Great. There's another question over there.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. The research was incredibly interesting. This question might also be a little tangential, but something I'm really interested in is China's algorithmic transparency regime. So they have the Internet Information Service algorithm filing system, which is which is similar to like what they have in like Canada and other places that require like certain design choices made in building automated decision systems to be disclosed to the state and publicly available. And coming from like an American perspective, I can understand like why that transparency exists, like especially. But I was curious what role algorithmic transparency plays when you're talking about citizen influence corporatism. Like, what purpose does that serve when you have this like high degree of state company overlap and interaction?
That's so interesting. I want to talk to you more about where you see greater transparency in China, because my experience, at least in the areas that Ting and I are working on, we don't see much transparency on the side of the firms. So Chinese tech companies are just as unwilling to share their data or give you insight on some of their core business secrets. The business secrets are, of course, part of it are the algorithms. So you are probably, I assume you're referring maybe to GitHub or some sort of sharing of information about algorithms by tech developers. But I'm happy to talk to you more individually after our discussion.
Great. I mean, my phone just reminded us that our time is up. So, well, thanks, Danny, for a wonderful talk. And, we've learned
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for a really extraordinary set of conversations. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay.